All right. Hello and welcome to our event. We have the illustrious and the super wonderful theologian from Britain, Dr. Anthony Reddie. And I'm glad that you could make it today. We are going to have a great conversation and we are going to hear a lot of stories too. So, without further ado, let me introduce Dr. Reddie and we'll begin our conversation. I hope that you came with lots of questions because he is really excited about engaging us on the topic of ministry as well as Black theology, of course. So, Dr. Reddie is a leading world authority on Black liberation theology, and he's also the editor in chief of Black Theology and International Journal. He has authored more than 19 books and 70 essays on Christian education and Black theology. As an activist scholar and pastor, Reddie has served the Methodist Church in the UK in the training of its preachers and its clergy. He was recently appointed director for the Oxford Center for Religion and Culture within Oxford University. Welcome, Dr. Reddie.
It's a genuine thrill to be here. It really is. So, yes, I'm looking forward to a very enriching time in conversation. What So what I thought I would do is, in the next hour or so, is that I would tell you 3 stories that I think are all significant about understanding Black experience in Britain, particularly as it pertains to ministry and pertains to theology, particularly Black theology. After each story, I'll pause and then invite questions, either about the story itself or about anything else that you want to ask me. I really don't mind. I'm a storyteller. I come from a storytelling family, and that's how I do my theology. Narrative is at the heart of what I do. So just some basic preliminaries even. Okay, well, okay. Anyway, some basic things to start with. Okay, I mean, I can't use big words. By way of background. So clearly there are lots of things that are similar about Black people in Britain and Black people in America, African Americans. But there are also some significant differences. And I think it's just quickly, it's worth me just outlining what we have in common and what key differences they are, particularly the differences, because they help to shape how we have thought about ministry and theology in Britain, and that I'm interested in how that looks from your perspective. So the big thing to say, what we have in common is that we are both sets of people descendant from enslaved Africans. That's a thing to say. So when I talk to students, I invariably introduce myself as I'm Anthony Reddie, and I'm the descendant of enslaved African people. And so Reddie, R-E-D-D-I-E, is not an African name. It's a Scottish name, actually. And that says that at some point in the early part of the 18th century, white people from Scotland who had been displaced by the English, and we'll say a little bit more about that in a moment in terms of the British Isles, is made up of 4 constituent groups: England, which is the biggest, Scotland, Ireland, and Wales. That makes up the British Isles, and what we sometimes call Great Britain. And great doesn't mean that we are great, G-R-E-A-T, although we like to think of ourselves as that, which is completely deluded. What it really means is Greater Britons. So Greater Britons means that like the collective understanding of these 4 people are a collective identity of Britons, but within it, there are 4 constituent parts. The key difference between us is that whilst my ancestors were indeed enslaved peoples, they were not enslaved in Britain. They were enslaved in the Caribbean. So I guess that that, like me, like you'll know, the Middle Passage, enslaved African peoples taken from West and Central Africa to the so-called New World. Most ended up in Brazil, actually. But then the next biggest group then ended up on the mainland in North America. And then the next largest group then went to the Caribbean islands that were owned by the British and the French. My parents were born in the Caribbean island of Jamaica. And Jamaica was owned and run by the British as part of their empire from 1694 right through to 1962. And the British Empire is the largest empire the world's ever seen. So at its peak, 24% of the world was controlled by one country. So a quarter of the world was controlled by one country, that's Britain. There is 44,000 square miles in circumference. So to put that into context for you, Britain is smaller than Texas. The state of Texas is bigger than Britain. And yet this one place, smaller than one of your biggest states, admittedly, controls a quarter of the world. And so at its peak, and this is something that school children would have been said, not in my generation, maybe a generation before me, that the sun never set on the British Empire. So if you go farthest east, Australasia, New Zealand, Pacific Islanders, they were owned and controlled by Britain. And you go right to the farthest west and you look at Canada. Obviously, it did include America, but like you had the good sense to break away in 1776. So obviously, like we don't count you. But Canada continued to be part of Britain until 1910. And so at any point across a 24-hour stretch, the sun would never set on the various places that the British owned and ruled. That's a key thing, therefore, to understand about Black theology in Britain, because as Black folk, we have not been in Britain for a huge length of time in comparison to African Americans. So essentially, the key date when we're thinking about Black lives in Britain is 22nd of June, 1948. So this year will be the 75th anniversary of the first of an influx of Black people from largely the Caribbean, including my parents, who were asked to come by the British. I remind white British people of that every single time. That essentially after World War II, so Britain wins the war, it defeats Nazi Germany. In more accurate terms, it's really Russia and America win the war, but Britain like to say that we did it. So anyway, so they win the war, but like we limp out of the war. We have lost huge numbers of men and women. And one of the things that happens to the white British psyche, and this will be part of my third story looking at white nationalism, is that so many working class white people went to fight for a better world, fight Hitler, and part of the promise of them going to fight was the belief that after the war, their lives would be improved. So post-World War II, 1945, many working class white people are now saying, that we did not fight a war to go back and do the low-paid jobs that we were doing before the war. Like we were promised a new life, a new world. And so the only way in which the British government, then at that point, a first Labour government, so equivalent of your Democrats, first kind of more progressive, supposedly slightly left-leaning government did, was to appeal to the empire. So they go to the empire and they say, we're short of labor. We invite anyone who wants to come from the colonies to come to Britain, and we will subsidize your travel. So it's not for nothing, but it's very, very cheap in order for you to come here and effectively do the jobs that white people don't want to do. So they send off to mainly the Caribbean first, because what the Caribbean has, rather than the continent of Africa, is that through slavery, the lingua franca is English. Most people in the Caribbean, English-speaking Caribbean islands, like my parents, English would have been their first language. Therefore, they're the preferred people rather than going to India or continent of Africa, where people would have learned English, but perhaps as a second or third language. So between the 22nd of January, 1948, through to roughly 1971, somewhere in the region of 3 million people traveled from the Caribbean to Britain as British subjects. So they're still part of the British Empire. At that point, no Caribbean country had been made independent yet. That's where my parents come from, Jamaica. My mum comes first. She came in January 1957. My father came 18 months later in 1959. They did not know each other in Jamaica. They met in Britain. So they meet in the late 50s. They fall in love very quickly. They get married. I'm the eldest of their 4 children born in the north of Bradford, north of England, city called Bradford. Probably news equivalent is somewhere like Cleveland. So it's a very, very not particularly pretty post-industrial city, makes its money on heavy industry. And most of the Black people who come to the city, they are working in factories, doing the jobs that would have been done by white people perhaps 20, 30 years early. So I'm born in 1964, so I'll be 59 this year. So all that background then leads me to the first story very quickly. So I'm the first person in my family to go to school in England. So I'm the eldest of 4 children. So my mum brings me to the gate and she hands me over to the reception teachers. These are teachers who, I guess, receive all the children who are new into the school. And it's at that moment I realized I'm Black. Up to that point, I'm living at home with my family. I think I know. It's a Caribbean migrant family. All my parents' friends are from the Caribbean, from the various islands, mainly Jamaica, which is the largest English-speaking island. But there are several other islands as well, all of whom are made up of people who have traveled from the Caribbean to come to Britain to get work. I realize I'm Black because at that point, every other kid in this school is white. And I'm standing there and they have all of us lined up, all the new kids are lined up. And the head teacher is talking to this reception teacher. And it's at that point, I realized not only am I Black, but I'm a problem. And I realize I'm a problem because as these 2 white teachers are talking, they're deep in conversation. And then periodically one turns and looks at me, points at me, then they turn back to each other and continue talking. So I'm sitting there thinking to myself, well, firstly, I'm the only Black kid here. Although I should say, in those days, I would have been called a colored kid. I was a colored child. So I'm the only colored child there. Everyone else is white. And they're talking about me, but not talking to me. But I know they're talking about me because they're not pointing to any of the white kids, they're only pointing to me. After what seems like an age, but looking back, it's probably only 7 minutes. 2 things happen. All the white kids go in one direction, so they go into the school. And I'm stood there by myself. And then I'm joined by another teacher. So another white woman comes out. So she comes from an adjacent block, a block next to the school. And she says, Anthony, you come with me. So all the white kids are going in one direction. I'm going in another direction. So off I go. But because I'm the eldest child, I'm the first one to go to school. My parents have never had children go to school in England. I think this is normal. I think, okay, well, obviously, they must know what they're doing. The white kids are going one direction, I go into another direction. I later find out that where they've taken me to is what's called an immigration centre. So immigration centres were things that the British government set up in order to try and resettle and socialise these coloured children who are coming from overseas, who would not understand British ways and British values and British culture. So they sent me to this immigration school. And I've often said that it's the only time I've been a genius in those 3 days, because in those 3 days, their assumption is that I've come from some far off place and don't understand anything about English, even though at that point, I probably never left Bradford. I was born in the city of Bradford. You'd have thought my accent might have been a bit of a giveaway. It's not an African accent. It's not a Caribbean accent. I'm a local kid. I just happen to be a Black kid. But what I remember in those 3 days, and I have to confess, I don't remember it very clearly. A lot of this is kind of revisionism. I've told the story so many times that I probably invented a whole backstory for myself. I don't really remember what happened. I have vague memories of being asked questions to which I already knew the answer. So this school thing seemed quite easy. It's like, so can you spell your name? Well, yeah, I can do that. Anthony. And do you know where you are? Well, Bradford. So in my head, I think myself, this school thing is really easy here because like you ask me stuff I kind of know already. I learned this from my mom. So hey, wow, this school thing. So anyway, so on the third day, and I do know this is true because my mom retold the story lots of times. I mean, she died 9 years ago, but she would dine out on this story. So on the third day, when my mom comes to collect me, the teacher who runs the centre, she runs out and says, Mrs. Reddie, before you go, I have to say, your son is exceptionally gifted. I've never met someone who is so intuitively clever as he is. Now, of course, that's what every mother wants to hear. Every mother wants to hear that her eldest child is indeed a genius. So my mom says, well, yes, I always knew Anthony was clever, but I didn't know he was a genius. She says, oh, wow, he is. I mean, his proficiency in English and his ability to pick up things is remarkable considering. And my mom says, considering what exactly? She says, well, considering, and we've probably teacher now gets embarrassed because she can suddenly sense that she's made a faux pas here, like she made a mistake. So she says, well, considering, well, you're not considering. And my mom says, no, I don't know what you mean. Considering what exactly? And she says, well, okay, well, let me just spell it out. So consider it's come all the way from Africa. And he's just come into this country. His ability to pick up things is remarkable. My mum says, well, firstly, he's not from Africa. He was born here in Britain. Secondly, she says, I'm not from Africa. I come from the Caribbean and I speak English. And thirdly, she says, my only language is English because we were colonized and made enslaved by you British. So we know your culture. We know it better than you do. I know all about Britain because that's what I learned in school back in Jamaica. Didn't know anything about African history. I learned about British history. We were a British colony. At which point, the teacher then realizing her error, immediately changed the paperwork I'm taking from this special immigration center put into normal school. And I go from being a genius to being average overnight. I tell that story just to say two things very quickly, and then I'll invite questions and conversations. Firstly, those immigration centers were set up on the assumption that even though the British Empire, its whole raison d'etre was to reproduce Englishness abroad. So when the Brits took over India, when they went to Australia, when they went to Canada and the Caribbean, they used Christianity as the means to civilize the so-called heathens, to take the white man's burden, as it was described by Rudyard Kipling, one of our famous English writers. And the white man's burden was the burden of trying to civilize all these backward people in the world where the British have come and taken over. So what they're trying to do is to reproduce people who are British. And they do a good job of it. They do such a good job that when my parents were growing up, they knew nothing of their ancestry, nothing of Africa, nothing of where they were taken as slaves. All they know is that the British came and civilized them. Yet despite that, when I'm born in Britain, they can't quite conceive that I'm really more like them than who's the other. They can't quite get into their head that I really am British, even though my accent says I was. I was born in a local hospital. At that point, as I said, I probably never even left the city, let alone left the country. And they're not quite sure I really belong. So rather than put me in a normal school, all the normal classes with white kids, they put me into a separate class. And what I should have said is that when I was in that class, all the other children are colored children like me. And some are Asian children. So at that point, early 60s, although it hadn't quite taken off yet, that once immigration from the Caribbean began to die down or began to peter out in the late 60s, early 70s, the next wave then came from India and Pakistan. It's the next wave. And the immigration centers were probably more relevant for them because English wasn't their first language. Their first language would be Urdu and Punjabi. But even so, there was still a racist intent that says that white people can travel the world and go as expats to other people's countries and never learn the cultures. And yet when we came to Britain, we had to go through some process to try and teach us so-called British values. That's the first point. Second point really is that our presence has been contested ever since. So even though there's been a mass British presence for 75 years now, so there'll be a big service in Westminster Abbey this June 22nd to mark the 75th anniversary of these people coming, we still periodically get, particularly politicians on the right, so our versions of Trump, will regularly use the language of white supremacy to say that we should not be here, that somehow what we need is repatriation, i.e. to be sent back to the places where your parents and grandparents came, because that's where you really belong, you don't belong here. And one still hears that. And so even a few years ago, we had a scandal, what's called the Windrush scandal, which is where people who had come in the 50s and 60s, what happened is that when their countries became independent, they lost the right to be British, but they didn't know that they lost the right, because the British did not tell them that the rules had changed. And so what happened is that unless you then apply specifically for British citizenship, your citizenship had been transferred from being British, even though you'd come on a British passport before your country become independent. And so what would happen is that a few people went on holiday and then found they could not get back into the country. Or there are others who, if they committed a crime, and if you commit a crime and you were not born in Britain and you go to prison for more than 1 year, you can then be deported. So there's still that contestation about why we about our presence in Britain and why we're here. So finally, what I will say before inviting questions is that I've often had this phrase, which I use in some of my books. So this comes from the Anti-Racist Alliance. This was a coalition of broadly progressive, left of centre activists in the 80s who were pushing back against white nationalism and racism that was trying to say we didn't belong here. And I used to have a poster in my room as a student. And the poster was a picture of of a large market, outdoor market in London. Most Black people live in London. 60-70% of all Black people in Britain live in London, in the capital. So Brixton in South London is our version of Harlem. It's one of the kind of iconic places where Black people live. So Harlem, obviously in Harlem Renaissance. So Brixton is our version of that. So it's a picture of Brixton High Street, the main street in the area, on a Saturday afternoon where people are shopping. And what you see is the whole of the British Empire. People from the Caribbean, from Africa, from India, from Pakistan, all shopping and all very visible, and hardly a white face on the poster. And at the bottom it says, "We are here because you were there. We are here because you were there." And what the poster says, which I remind British people, is that if you resent immigration, if you resent people coming from the so-called empire, then like you should not have gone and conquered those people in the first place and colonized them. But you conquered and colonized them and then invited them to come to the country. And then once we came here, you realized that you didn't really want us here. And there's been this constant argument about how much we belong and whether we belong. And so one of the key things that Black theology in Britain has had to fight for, but I think more broadly, ministry in many of our churches, is to create a framework that enables people who are constantly told that we don't belong, and constantly there are lots of examples. Just one very, very quick example. I mean, there's so many stories I could tell. So one quick example was, there was a football tournament in which England played. This would have been, I'm trying to think what it would have been. It would have been 4 years ago. And Britain gets, and the English team gets to the final in football, what you would call soccer. And the team is it's a very mixed team. It represents modern Britain. So it's 11 people in the team, of whom 7 are white, 4 are black. And all the black players, their parents come from the Caribbean or from Africa. The game's a stalemate, so it goes into what you would call overtime. And then eventually, without getting into the complexities of soccer, because most of you probably don't know a great deal about it, it goes to what's called penalties. So penalties is a very arbitrary way in which a number of people will take a single shot at goal, and the ones who score the most win. Unfortunately, 2 of the black players missed the crucial penalties that could have won England the game. It just happens. Everyone says, actually, like, you never condemn the players who missed the penalties. You simply applaud them for being brave enough to go and take them with all the pressure. All that to say that previously white players have missed penalties all the time, and they are saluted, as I said, for being brave enough to stand up to the pressure. These 2 black players miss penalties, and they get somewhere in the region of 5 million hits on Twitter of hate mail. And most of the hate mail is saying, if you had been white and properly English, you would have scored that penalty. You would have been successful. But because you don't really belong here, and not all of them are born in Britain, by the way, and because we don't see you as one of us, we are blaming you personally for losing us this tournament. And so at that point, at a popular level, I'm able, because I'm on Twitter, to then to say to white people, that tells you where we are in terms of racism in Britain. That even though we've been here for 3 or 4 generations, and all of these players were born in Britain, when something goes wrong, you always use us, black people, as a scapegoat. I'll stop there. So any questions, please, on anything I have just said. And I hope that you could follow my accent.
As people are getting their questions together, I should ask, would it be helpful for you, Dr. Reddie, if you're able to see and or hear the participants instead of just them typing in their questions?
Yes, it would, please. Yeah.
Okay, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to promote everyone here to be a panelist. So everyone is going to get a little notification on their screen. Just go ahead and say yes. And that way we're going to just convert this meeting from a webinar into an impromptu Zoom class so that everyone can be seen and they can ask their questions. And while everyone is rejoining the meeting, I have a question that I will start off asking.
Yeah, please.
So you mentioned the commonalities and differences between Africans in the US and UK. What are your thoughts about the commonalities and differences between white nationalism in the UK and the US?
Yeah, there are lots of commonalities. I think what you have in both cases are countries that are shaped by white Anglo-Saxon culture. So one of the things I often say to many people in this country is that the bad habits of being an empire and controlling other people is what Britain did first, but then we passed on the mantle to the Americans. So essentially, post-World War II, what emerges from that is that America comes clearly the most dominant political power in the world after World War II. Once Britain limps out of the war and effectively has to give up its empire. And so what you have in both contexts is a place that imports labor from various parts of the world. In your case, obviously, imports it through forced migration in terms of enslavement. In Britain, it's done through colonialism and empire. But essentially what you create is a black underclass. And the biggest fallacy in both contexts is this false consciousness of white supremacy. So what you have in both contexts is this construct of race that has no intellectual or actual basis to it whatsoever. So every test that has ever been made to try and prove that white people are superior has always failed. It's a nonsense. There was no such thing as race. There's only the human race. However, the myth of white supremacy that exists in both contexts is largely then overplayed by class. What I mean by that is that, so take Trump and Boris Johnson, so two key white alpha males who have wealth and privilege. And in both contexts, what they're able to do, which actually, if you think about it, makes no kind of intellectual or philosophical sense whatsoever, as both neoliberal people who believe in having a small state, who believe in policies that will enrich white men like themselves of privilege. They convince poor white people that they have more in common with them who are rich and privileged than they do with other poor people who share their experience of being undermined by a capitalist system that never has the poorest people in mind at all. So Boris Johnson with Brexit is able to shamelessly say to white working class people, you're poor and you're disenfranchised and you're ignored, but that's because all these other people are coming taking your jobs. It's all these other black folk. That's the reason why. So here's the thing. If you vote for me, what I will do is I will make Britain great again. I will put the great back into Britain. That was one of his slogans, put the great back into Britain. And I will restore your sense of marginalization and disaffection. Everything will get better. And here's the thing. The poor white folk believe it because they want to believe it. One of the things that my grandma used to say to me is that you can't fool someone who doesn't want to be fooled. So they were happy to believe the narrative, even though it made no goddamn sense, but they believed it because intrinsically it fed into their white supremacist notions that somehow their failure wasn't their failure. It's not their fault. Clearly someone else has done it for them. And that's exactly what they have in common. So in both contexts, whether it's Brexit or Trumpism, and the scandal is that Christianity then feeds into that. So just as I understand it, a majority of white evangelicals voted for Trump, is the same way that in Britain, it was particularly the Church of England, so white evangelical Anglicans vote predominantly for Brexit and for the Conservative Party. That's our version of the Republicans. And they vote for that because what these white nationalists are able to play on, they're able to play on this deep-seated unhappiness that white people have, at the feeling that somehow they've been displaced by others. So just two very, very quick things, and then we'll take another question. One is, there's this fantastic quote that I think comes from Katie Cannon. So obviously it comes from your context, but it works just as well in our context. So she says, when entitlement is the norm, equality feels like a defeat. When entitlement is the norm, equality feels like a defeat. So when Black folk and other Black and brown people begin to make progress, there's no evidence that we're taking over. All we're doing is just pushing towards equality, which we still haven't got yet, but at least we're getting a little closer. But here's the thing. If whiteness is based upon complete entitlement, so the fact is that most of the resources are the ones that go to white privilege, or should be accurately, rich white privilege. Suddenly the fact that Black and brown people are making a little progress suddenly feels that things have been taken off, like the majority. So what you get in Britain is, are people saying, oh my God, you know, they're taking over the country. And it's like, taking over what? How exactly have we taken over anything? But of course, like, you can play to that white fragility that is based upon this notion of supremacy. That's the first thing. Second, in terms of Brexit, so I wrote a whole book on Brexit. Here it is, called Theologizing Brexit. 140,000 words worth of academic research that in the end can be summed up on one tweet. So all I would say is, don't bother buying the book, just remember the tweet. So here's the tweet. I said, Brexit is the shingles to the chickenpox of empire. Brexit is the shingles to the chickenpox of empire. So if you've ever had shingles as an adult, the first thing you know is that when you were a kid, like, you had chickenpox. And the chickenpox never went away. It just got incubated into your body. And then at some point where you're stressed as an adult, it comes back as shingles. That's what happened in Britain. The empire went, but all the grandeur and the delusions of Great Britain, of empire, that did not go away. And so all it required was some right-wing demagogue, in this case, Boris Johnson, to come back and to trigger that and to say, well, of course, we can be great again. In America's case, it's that obviously post-World War II, you're top dog. But basically, China has come and bought up so much of America. You're still the most important country, but you're not as powerful as you used to be. And now that China's pressing you and pushing you, along comes Trump and says, well, basically, I mean, I can make America great again. I can put you back into your position of great supremacy. And of course, it's based on lies, but it's based on myth. It's based on complete myth. But it works because people want to believe it. I see a hand from Pastor Ed. Pastor Ed.
Oh, actually, Vernell was first.
Sorry. Oh, sorry. Sorry. Okay. Sorry, Vernell. I apologize. I'll tell you what, I will keep quiet. You do the direction in London. Okay.
That's okay. Thank you, though. That's okay. And so what I'm listening to you, I'm wondering if the same thing, some of the same things in American Christianity are playing out in Britain. And that is in America, it seems as if there are two Christianities that have created, which is this white supremacist, evangelical Christian nationalism that has, been here, doing, theological gymnastics to justify oppression since the colony, since slavery. And then everyone else who are, trying to live their best God-fearing life. Is that the same? Is that kind of similar in Britain, where you have, these Christian, sometimes we call them Christian nationalists, evangelicals, that plays out in England as well?
It does and it doesn't. So I'll try to be as brief as I can, because people do PhDs of this stuff. So, okay. Yes, in one sense, there's a very similar phenomena. So there is this white Christian nationalism. In Britain, although it's quite specific in some regards, it tends to be Anglican. It has to be Church of England, because that's the church that's linked to the aristocracy, linked to the monarchy. So, for example, every one of our kings and queens has to be an Anglican. So Prince Charles had to be a member of the Church of England in order to be king. So although it is generic, it's more specific than it is in America. That's the first thing. But secondly, it's complicated by the fact that because of empire and colonialism, what we don't have in Britain that you have in America is the strong Black independent church tradition. Mm. So, for example, as a Methodist, we don't have many separate, in Britain, we don't have a separate Black Methodist denomination like you do with the AME or CME or AMEZ. In Britain, there's only one Methodist church. Now, having said that, there are different congregations. So I go to a Black majority congregation, but in Britain, our only Methodist church is the equivalent of the UMC. So it's a white majority church, and that goes across all the board. So again, there's not a separate Black Baptist church. There's kind of one Baptist union. There's one Reformed church. There's kind of one Catholic church. And that's because what British Empire did was to give the language of integration and assimilation. So when people like my parents came, they were encouraged to join existing churches and not to create separate ones.
Mm.
And therefore, I think one of the reasons why our anti-racist fight has not been as highly developed as it has been in America is because I guess if you have a separate church tradition, you then have a greater measure of self-determination. If you're part of the same denomination that is treating you as a second-class citizen, it's then harder to create an alternative framework for your own self-determination if you are still bound to the same institution that is oppressing. And so our development has been a lot slower than in America. So let's give one quick example. So obviously James Cone writes Black Theology and Black Power in 1969. Our first book in Black Theology is not until 1998. That's Robert Beckford's Jesus is Dread. So our movement is still much smaller than yours because we are still fighting with this language of integration, and anything that is seen to be Black is seen as being separatist and is seen as being schism. So that's probably the biggest difference, really, for now.
Thank you for that. That was very enlightening.
Pastor Harris.
Thank you very much. First of all, it's good to see you all. Good, many of you we know. Hey sis, how you doing? Dr. Clay, God bless you. Dr. Reed, I really appreciate what you just said because that's exactly where I was going to go. Once you mentioned the Anglican Church and the Charles Wesley influence on Methodism, you actually broke down for me what I was going to ask you because of the separation of the church in the 1796 and that particular point of time. The challenge that I have, and I'm having a challenge because in my mind, I don't know where I got this, that the challenges here were less than or less than the challenges or equal to the challenges elsewhere. But you're enlightening me that in some ways we're a bit ahead of where you are. And you just right now what I was going to ask you about there being a separatist movement or seemingly one, but being, the United Methodist Church now is actually the same church as my estimation. They just changed their name and said we want to be united, but it's still the original church. And that in itself presents a little bit of a challenge, especially when here, I don't know if you're aware, I'm a part of the AME Zion Church. And when we have our general conferences, we usually every 4 years have somebody from the now United Methodist Church come and apologize for the challenges that have taken place throughout time. They come, they apologize, but when the apology is over, we go back to being who we are. And so part of the question I have when it comes to ecumenism, and with that being in Europe, how in fact that is viewed when you have people from all over coming into what seemingly is the heart of the Christian movement, but it's a Christian movement that is based on, as Willie James Jennings talks about in his book, supersessionism. And the creation of a social construct that does not really exist, has no validity, but has been sold as the premier way of being. Do you in any way and at all think, Vernell, I appreciate you when you talk about two different Christianities. Do you, in your experience, believe that ecumenism will really ever be to the place where there is a total acceptance? There's a difference between assimilation and integration. And when we're always expected to be somebody else, then we never get a chance to be who we are. And is that possible from a place of ecumenism when ecumenism is being encouraged? Because again, it seems as though it's not an acceptance of us ever showing up at the table. I hope I make sense.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think I'll probably answer that in two ways, holding two things in tension. So I think from a theological perspective, I would say that given my continued belief in Christian hope, in theory, all things are possible, theologically. But that is tempered by our social realities of power. And so the social realities of power are pushing at the more theological and, dare I say, the more utopian ways in which we think about what it is to be human beings. And I think this is where Cohn's work is very, very helpful, because I think what we take from the cross and the lynching tree is a fundamental a fundamental difference between how we see the cross in terms of the social imagination of Black folk and white folk. And it seems to me that the only way ecumenism is ever going to work is when white people repent of the sin of white supremacy and say that the real savior is a person of color, was an oppressed Palestinian Jew, who then becomes the Christ of faith and continues to witness to God's liberating work in Jesus' life on the cross. When they resolve to follow the true Jesus and not the one that they've created in the imagination of white supremacy. So I love it when Cohn says that, like, the white Christ is the Antichrist. Absolutely. No one has killed more people, if we look across the world, than the white Jesus has. No one has. No one's. So, I mean, it's all these teaching that you sometimes get from white evangelicals about, syncretism, and we have to be careful of witchcraft and voodoo and hoodoo and these other things that come from darkest parts of the world. Nonsense. Trust me, voodoo could only dream of killing as many people as the white Jesus has. I mean, white Jesus killed more than any other religious tradition could ever imagine. So the fundamental truth is this: ecumenism often ends up being nice, polite people saying nice, polite things to each other that has no substance and no basis in reality. And until white supremacy then rids itself of that, then actually all these conversations are, I mean, they're nice and they probably make for nice social meeting points, but they don't do anything substantive. So let me give you one example in my context that tells you how deep-seated this is. I constantly say to my Methodist friends, there are 4 different branches of Methodism in America: 3 Black, 1 white. UMC, AME, CME, and your tradition, AME Zion. Yet the only one the British Church has any direct bilateral relationship with is the UMC. That's the only one it has a relationship to. So when they talk about white Methodism and they talk about, when you talk to Bishop so-and-so, so-and-so, Bishop so-and-so, so-and-so, I'm saying, yeah, but wait a minute, like, you do know that, like, the 3 other branches. And they say, of course we do, Anthony. And so I pull them up, they assure me that, yes, we will put what you've said in place, we will reach out. Then at the next meeting, like, we have the same conversation again, and say, well, okay, like, we need to meet Bishop so-and-so. And I said, but in the last meeting, did I not bring to your attention there were 3 other branches of Black Methodists? And then you realize that, of course, such is the power of white supremacy, that even the person who's taking the minutes has a very clever way of taking the minutes so that my objection and intervention never turned up in the minutes. So when I then say, but at the last meeting, I drew your attention to the fact that we only have bilateral relationships with the white majority Methodist Church. But like the 3 others, we don't. And they said, but like, there's no record of this in the minutes, Anthony. And it's like, yeah, but I said it, do. Well, but the minute, and it's like, okay. I will say it now, and I sit next to the minute taker and I say, you write that damn thing down. I have just said, and they said, okay, we'll write it down. And after about 3 or 4 successive meetings where it felt a bit like Groundhog Day, that basically I would turn up to the meeting and it's as if nothing had ever happened. I thought, you know, forget this. I'm not even going to bother anymore, because you clearly do not want to talk to Black Methodists unless they belong to the white majority church. That is the one that you feel comfortable with, because the British version is a white majority church run by white people, with some Black people in some prominent position, but essentially run on the cult of whiteness. So when I then bring it up and I say, you know, I'm not going to any more of your meetings, it's a waste of my time. I've got better things to do. Now suddenly I get people writing to me, Anthony, like, we're so upset, but like, why aren't you coming? You know, you have a responsibility to come and represent Black people. You not coming is terrible. You're not interested in ecumenism anymore. It's like, but wait a minute. I came to the meeting and I tried to inform you of your limitations. You ignored me. I've withdrawn because I've got better things to do. And now you're telling me I'm at fault. That happens so often. So what's interesting is that the British Methodist Church, we have relationships with Methodists all over the world. And yet, interestingly enough, it's only the UMC and there's a white Methodist. No, it's only the UMC, because in Australia and Canada, they now have united churches. So the Methodists have linked with Presbyterians and with Congregationalists to create uniting churches. So really, it's only the UMC that has voting rights in our British conference. So you could turn up as a guest and they would say, well, it's really nice to see you from the AME Zion. They'll probably sit you in a nice seat, but like, you can't vote. But a white bishop from the UMC can vote. And when I ask why that is, they will give you every excuse under the sun, except for the honest one, which is that we only really care about the white Methodists because we look at them and they look like us, and we assume that therefore like we have a fraternal relationship, but we just don't understand like these Black people.
Thank you. That was very clear. It's an alignment with this creation of the social construct of white supremacy, and they're not letting it go, not on any level. And the capitalistic approach, everything is a commodity, and we've never ever made it beyond being a commodity, and the commodity never ever be equal to the owner of the commodity.
No, absolutely, absolutely. Okay. So the question is, can you talk a bit about the 3 critiques of white British culture? Sorry, it's gone. A white British culture, Rastafari theology, Black and womanist theology from a critical challenge of the other section of your Brexit book. Oh, okay. Oh, I can happily do that. Okay, so basically, so for those who haven't read the Brexit book, in one of the later chapters, I talk about what it means to be perceived as the other. And rather than feel embarrassed about it, to embrace it, to say, you know something, we are going to be the other, and we're going to be a radical challenge to the notion of how Britain thinks about itself. So actually, I'll use that as an excuse to talk about the second story. So the second story very quickly, which actually then will explain the question that you've asked, Damon. So about 2005, I'm doing a workshop in South London, so in Brixton. Again, that's our equivalent of Harlem. So this is in a Black majority Pentecostal church. So one of the things to understand about Black British Christianity is that the first wave of the migrants from this Windrush generation, so let's say 48 to roughly early 70s, that all of them would have come from the historic churches founded by European missionaries. So there'll be many Anglicans. Well, in terms of size of numbers, Anglicans first, Catholics second, Methodist third, Baptist fourth, Reformed fifth. Those would be, and all of them, and all the Christianities would have had their roots in European missionary movements that went to the Caribbean, founded churches, made people members, and then those members come back to Britain as British subjects, and then they join existing churches. Around the late 60s, early 70s, what you then get are churches that are not part of the British historic church tradition. They're coming out of Pentecostalism. And those churches in turn have two genesis. Most of them actually come out of white Southern Pentecostalism. And then missionaries went to the Caribbean. So like the Church of God of Prophecy, New Testament Church of God, those churches with their and here's the irony about how Black people can be very, very naive and susceptible. So these white racist people from the American South, they go to the Caribbean as missionaries, found churches, and Black people join them. These Black people then come to Britain and they bring their churches with them. So you have a branch of Pentecostalism whose antecedents are white Southern American segregationists. That will explain the story I'm about to share when you understand that historical development. There's a smaller number that come from the Caribbean, founded by Caribbean people. And then more recently, there are churches that are coming from Africa. I come from the continent, they're the much younger ones. But I'm at this church, this is a historical Caribbean Pentecostal church, about 30 years old, founded by people from the Caribbean, but founded on the basis of white American segregationists from the American South. So I'm doing this session and I'm talking about Black theology, and I'm talking about the need to recontextualize Christianity within Black experience. And that's what I'm saying is, I'm saying what Black folk need to do is what every other group has done already. So if you go to Russia and you look at Russian Orthodox Church, it's Christianity, but it's Christianity that's been fused with, in a problematic way, actually looking at what they're doing in Ukraine, been fused with Russian culture. You go to Sweden and you go to their churches and you go to particularly Lutheran churches and you see a church that reflects Swedish culture. I said, as Black Caribbean people, we're the only people who have been assimilated into a church whose doctrines and traditions hate us and were created to make us less than human, and yet we still go to those churches and we still feel like we can belong in an unproblematic way. What we need is that like we have to create our own theologies and our own, and we have to contextualize it. And I said, oh, obviously Cohn and the Americans are helpful, but obviously their experience is not our experience. So we have to develop our own Black British theology. At the end of the talk, a young man in his early 20s. I mean, it'd be someone who'd been older in my parents' generation, I might have been more forgiving because they were brought up under colonialism and taught to see themselves as third-class citizens, or as less than. That's the whole point of colonial education. But this guy's born in Britain, been to British schools, quite frankly, shouldn't know better. He gets up and he's angry with me. He says, Dr. Reddie, I don't know why you keep going on about this blackness. Every minute it's blackness and black. He says, I'm a Christian. And I said, okay, I get that, but actually I said, if you look at the New Testament, the word Christianity is never used. That itself is a construct. Actually, Paul doesn't plant Christianity, Paul plants churches. And every church, I said, is some type of church. Every church is in a particular context, in a particular time and space. So therefore, when someone says to me, I'm a Christian, my next question is, yeah, but what kind of Christian are you? Which church do you go to? What's its doctrines? What's its traditions? What's its different emphases? There's no such thing as Christianity. I said, that is a construct. So tell me what church you go to and I'll tell you what kind of Christian you are. He says, that's irrelevant. And here's the key word he says, and this part is in tears now because he's really upset with me. He says, I stopped being Black when I was saved. I stopped being Black when I was saved. And my response without thinking was, when did blackness become so bad that God had to save you from it? Now, here's the thing about that Pentecostal church. They cheered him, they booed me. They booed me. Now, here's the thing. You know, I mean, I've been booed by white people. I take it as a badge of honor, you know. If I turned up and I talked to you as a group of white people and you love me too much, clearly I've not done my job properly. So, you know, so if you boo me, I can't say I like it, but yeah, you know, it's a badge of honor. You know, I'm a black theologian. I'm meant to upset people. But when your own people boo, man, that's hard. It's like, really? Seriously? You're booing me? And they're booing me because what they've internalized in this Pentecostal tradition is that, if I put it bluntly, the only black thing about the church is that they sing music from a black cultural perspective. And the preachers, obviously having learned some of the tropes that come from America, like they'll do the hooping. I mean, they don't do it very well, but like, you know, they'll try to do some of the hooping and whatever. That's the only black thing about it. Because all their doctrines and their teachings and what they've internalized is white segregationist religion from the American South that went to the Caribbean and put on a black skin. And then comes to Britain. So much so that when you then have this phenomenon of the Brexit vote, so part of what the Brexit vote also does, Boris Johnson again playing these tropes, is to say that what we need to do is to re-emphasize Christian Britain. Christian Britain needs to stand up against Islam. It needs to stop all these foreigners coming into the country, don't understand our tradition. We need to restate our Christian values. Now, most people who are sensible can see that for what it is. That Christian values is just a synonym for whiteness. That's all it is. Swap one for the other. Christian values, whiteness, they're both the same thing. It's just a different set of language to try to disguise and make it look a bit less racist. Except for, and this is a tragedy, of that most black people voted against Brexit, but those who voted for it tended to be Pentecostals. And they voted for it because what they think they're doing is standing up for Christian Britain. But all they're doing, as I say in the book, is a bit like turkeys voting for Christmas. They're essentially like you're voting for something that is going to ultimately destroy you if it gets a chance, but you're voting for it anyway. Turkeys voting for Christmas. So what I then do in that book is to say, you know, actually, this is the myth of integration here. So the myth of integration is that what we as British black people get fooled into believing is that somehow if we're less black, if we try not to be too distinctive, we try to buy into the majority culture, then they will accept us. And Christianity is then one of the markers that makes us somehow belong as compared to being Muslims or belong to some other religious tradition. So when I was growing up, Rastafari was the bogeyman within many black families. So in many black Caribbean families, the two prevailing threats were always that their teenage children would either join a gang or they'd become Rasta. And actually, in some contexts, they'd probably prefer them to join a gang than become Rasta, because at least if you join a gang, then okay, like you might be mugging people, but like you might still be Christian. So better a Christian mugger, I mean, obviously it makes no sense, but better being a mugger who still kind of believes in Jesus than someone who might be peaceful, but actually is belonging to another religious tradition that is not washed in the blood, so to speak, of Jesus Christ. So there was a lot of demonization against Rastafari in the 70s and 80s. Its popularization really came from Bob Marley, who obviously was Jamaican, but obviously a lot of the Caribbean people would be Jamaican, so they would have identified with Rasta. And part of its power was that because it was not acceptable to the mainstream, and because Christianity has always been tied into empire and tied into respectability politics, that part of its attraction then was that essentially, if being different is going to get you disliked, then like you may as well be disliked and have a measure of self-determination and confidence in yourself than be integrated into a Christianity that is going to teach you to hate your blackness. So this young man, when he says, I stopped being black when I was saved, he didn't just wake up one day and make that up. This is something that his church had taught him throughout the whole of his life, to the point whereby being black and Christian seemed like an oxymoron. So when I'm saying, actually what we have to do is to elevate our blackness, because that's our defining reality. When we walk down the street, as I said later on in the same workshop, and the police come by, now admittedly, thankfully our police don't carry guns. So, you know, I mean, I give God for that. I give God thanks for that. Our police don't carry guns. Like, they carry sticks or batons, and they can beat the crap out of you, but at least like they're not going to shoot. Okay, you know, so let's give thanks like for small mercies here. You know, I mean, like, we don't get shot, but our police routinely will stop and just beat up black people. And there's no evidence that if they stop me and I say, actually, officer, before you hit me, let me just tell you that I'm washed in the blood of the Lamb of Jesus Christ. Trust me, that has never stopped anyone from getting a beating. So this notion that our Christian identity, this abstract thing of being a Christian, somehow makes you different from other black folk who are not, is a complete nonsense. So what is interesting about the early developments of black theology, and the key book for this is Robert Beckford's Jesus' Dread, as I said, DLT 1998, is that his book looks at how we can draw on Rastafari and this sense of what it is to be considered an outsider, but to use the outsider as a motif, as a way of saying, well, our best way of existing in British society is not to try and be white and try to integrate, but it's to find our own spaces and to develop a sense of self-determination and agency that allows us to be ourselves, but not to be dominated, or not to feel that we somehow have to be less of ourselves in order to belong. So when I use Rasta, I used it partly because it's something I knew about, because I remember having older relatives who became Rastas. And what was interesting was that their parents hated them. And they hate them for doing that. And in some regards, almost gave the impression that they had more respect for white people who were racist than they did for their own children who had left the faith and joined something else that gave them a sense of existential freedom. So I mean, that's what I'm trying to draw on in the book. But like I said, this book here, Is God Colorblind, is essentially the book I wrote that was inspired by that incident in Brixton in 2005. So when I said, is God colorblind, really that's where it came from, because one of the pushbacks from people who were supporting this young man were people saying, but God is colorblind. God does not see color. And my response was, well, firstly, how do you know what God sees? You know, I mean, there's a certain arrogance there to say that we know what God sees. But secondly, I said, fundamentally is that our differences come from God's self. So God is the one that's created all this difference, only to turn around and not see it. Well, that makes no sense whatsoever. So I'll create difference and then not see it. So essentially what I'm arguing in the book is to say that God does see color. Our issues, as Black folk have always known, is not the difference that's the problem, it's the value judgments that we place on them. is this assumption that blackness is subordinate to whiteness. I have no problem with you seeing me as a black person. Just don't assume that I'm inferior to you when you see me. So any questions on the story that I just shared? Or
I
indeed any
just
questions about the
want
other?
to, we have about 15 more minutes with Dr.
Yeah,
Reddie,
sure.
although, you know, we could go on, but we will have to invite you back. I'm so excited that we're having type of
I would love to come back. Seriously, I would love to come back. It's been a real joy to share with you. But yeah, but any more questions? I mean, please just.
I'm sorry, Pastor Harris, but there was a question in the chat here. Did you?
Yeah.
I was going to just read that out loud.
No, go ahead. Go ahead with it.
Dr. Reddie. Jalen was asking, Dr. Reddie, he's interested to hear more about how the Methodist Church in your context is being affected by and how the church is responding to the issue, the current issue of disaffiliation surrounding the LGBTQIA plus community that is currently plaguing the UMC.
Yeah. So actually, yeah, and that's a really good question. And I would say I'm pleased to say that for all my criticisms of British Methodism, of which there are many, I have left it and rejoined on several occasions. You know, I mean, I tried to become a Baptist, but I'm just not a Baptist, to be honest with you. I mean, I tried, you know, but yeah. I mean, I could never join the Church of England, so I can never be an Anglican. So yeah, I mean, so. But I think the one thing I'm very proud of is that we have become a fully inclusive church. So in 2019, we passed a resolution that said that we would fully recognize the full inclusion of LGBTQI. And we had a holding position for a number of years where we were trying to keep the evangelicals and the more progressives in tension. That's what's called the Derby Resolution. So in 1993, we passed, in our conference, we passed a resolution that had 5 clauses. And the first clause was that we affirmed the ministry of LGBTQI people. That's the first clause. But the second clause, which kind of was like the evangelical pushback, was to say that what we also upheld were these traditional teachings around human sexuality, which basically meant fidelity in marriage and abstinence out of it. And the reason why that could be held was because obviously 93, there was no provision for same gender loving marriage or indeed blessings. That just could not happen. So basically, if you were LGBTQ, you had to be celibate. So the church would recognize your orientation, but not allow you to be in relationships, particularly those relationships were sexually intimate. Once the Labour government, under Tony Blair, I think in 2010, once they had passed the law that allowed civil partnerships, so not marriage, but certainly a contracted relationship that would be recognized by the states and crucially recognized in terms of inheritance laws. Once that was passed, then when Cameron and the Conservatives then actually surprised the fact that the Conservatives did that, because normally they tend to be the ones holding on to traditional teachings. But when they then passed a revised law that moved from just civil partnerships to same-sex marriage, that forced the Methodist Church then to go back to revisit our resolutions, because like we couldn't hold this holding position anymore. We had to take one side or the other. And actually, it's interesting in that I think the decision we've taken was really pushed by pragmatism, more so than principle. But I don't care which way we did it. Like, we took the right decision as far as I'm concerned. And what I mean by pragmatism was that, like, we had a 3-year consultation. So for 3 years, we sent out basic material that had been created by the Central Church to every district synod. So our district synod would be like your conferences, because because America is so much bigger than us. That essentially, as I understand, like you have different conferences. Like we have one conference, but different districts, you have different conferences under a general conference, as I understand it, I think. So basically, so we sent out learning materials or discussion material to all the different churches to get people's views on where the church should go. When that came in after the 3-year consultation, I'm told, I wasn't directly involved in that process, but I know several people who were. And I think the pragmatism came down to this. It came down to, okay, so like we have to make one decision, one direction or another direction. Who will we lose the most, or who will we retain the most, depending on which way we go? Essentially, is what it came down to. And essentially, I'm told that in the end, it was like, so what will happen is that if we vote to resist the move towards gay marriage, we will lose more progressives and liberals than we will lose evangelicals if we do take that move. So in the end, what our conference said was, I mean, it was an acrimonious debate, but in the end, actually, I think two things I think really settled it. In our context, our church is a dying church in the sense in which our numbers have plummeted year on year for the last 40 years. And so, so our British Methodist Church is about a third the size it was less than 100 years ago. That, like, you know, it's aged and people have left for other denominations. If you talk to most people now who are under 30, they are broadly progressive. If you talk to the young people who are still in the church, in our youth clubs and our Sunday schools, they are broadly in favor of full inclusion. People who are most resistant to it and are conservative are older people, 40, 50 plus. So part of the pragmatic move was, okay, that will lose people, but that will tend to lose older people. If we're going to retain people, then better that we retain the younger ones who will help to drive the church and be still part of the church in 20 years' time. Like the ones who don't like it will be dead in 20 years anyway. So I have to say, it wasn't necessarily a principle vote. I mean, I would like to tell you that we sat down, we read the scriptures, we did our exegesis, and then we said, you know, Smith, this is how the Holy Spirit is telling us we should go in this direction. I'm sure some will tell you that now, but I don't think that was the driver. I think the driver at the time was basically, so essentially, like, we're going to lose some folk. In terms of numbers, which makes the most logical, and basically it makes sense to go in this direction because in a sense that's where British society is. On the whole, you know, if you talk to most people in society now, they will say, actually, like, we should be fully inclusive. Most younger people are like that. So, for example, I mean, I don't have children, but like my nephew, Noah, he's 21, he's my younger brother's son. He's at university. He's been brought up in a relatively conservative evangelical household. So his dad is he's not overly conservative, but certainly I think would be slightly tentative about LGBT issues. His son, who's gone to a very mixed school in London, whose friends are trans, who has a number of friends whose parents are same gender. For him, this is shocking. This is normal. This is how people live. This is the modern world. He looks at his dad and says, but Dad, you know, I mean, I don't get where you get all this. And Dad will say, well, you know, but the Bible says, at which point Noah, who was doing theology, by the way, I mean, that's probably my greatest inheritance is to have your nephew say, but uncle, having sat in classes in school and hear people reading your work, and I'm saying, that's my uncle. That's my uncle you're reading there. He said, how could I do anything but theology? And I'm thinking, thank you, Jesus, thank you. Yes. Anyway, at which point Noah then turns to his dad and says, but Dad, The Bible outlaws lots of things. Why is it that only homosexuality is the one that we have to hold on to? Because like, the Bible's not capitalist, but somehow Christians can make peace with that. So, you know, I mean, so I think we have moved towards full inclusion because the numbers made it easy for us, really, if I'm being honest.
Do you mind taking our last question, Dr.
Oh, please do.
Reddie?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. No problem. I will try not to go on for so much. Yeah, I'll try to be brief.
Okay.
Me and brief don't really go together, but I will try to be brief. Okay, go on.
Was that my
Okay.
cue? Damien, was that my cue or was it something else? Okay.
Yes, sir. That's all you, sir.
Thank you very much. Dr. Reddie, from your perspective, I heard you say something a minute ago about reading the Bible. Recently, it's come from the Lord, I would guess, about what we accept and what we don't. Currently, many people in America, especially the older people, seem to tend to lean to the 1611 version of the Bible, known as the King James version of the Bible. And as we look at what happened in 1619 in this country, the Bible seemed to have been used as, was weaponized in order to control people. What is your view on that as a theologian?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so the first thing I tried to do in all my work is to try and wean Black people off the King James Bible, but it has not worked. I've failed. I mean, I've tried, but, you know, because basically, if you know anything about its creation, it was a version of the Bible that its interpretation is pro-empire and is pro-monarchy and pro-top-down power. So, you know, I mean, and this is not conjecture, this is a fact that anyone who knows anything about the scholars who were brought together under the patronage of the king was to create a version that would be the antithesis of the Geneva Bible that had gone before, that was more egalitarian in its interpretation. All that to say that the Bible of Empire, i.e. the King James version, is the one that was exported across all the natives and used as the de facto one to teach a version of Christianity that was to make people docile and to make them good slaves and to make them accepting of white supremacy and white hegemony. So one of the things I've tried to get congregations to do, and it's easier obviously with younger pastors than it is with older ones, is to say that we need to have different revised versions. You know, I mean, the ones I quite like is the revised, RSV. Yeah, so the revised standard version of the Bible, which was a new translation that was done, I think, can't remember exactly the date of it, but that's the one that I kind of grew up with, which is better than the King James. There are some really, really interesting ones. I mean, certainly in America, I think one advantage you have over us is that you have a wealth of Black biblical scholars that we don't have. And so the likes of Will Gaffney and various other people who have created things like the People's Bible and various other commentaries that I think are much more inclusive. And what they do is that they try to offer a critical riposte to the earlier version. Now, that said, I think something like Randall Bailey, who some of you will know, will also remind us that actually, like, we need to have a hermeneutic of suspicion at any version of the Bible that's been created. So in some respects, the RSV is better than the King James, but there are still texts in it that are problematic for us as Black folk if we take seriously our inheritance of coming from enslaved peoples. So I would say that whatever version we have, what we always need is a hermeneutic of suspicion that simply says to us and repeatedly asks us, if I read this and take it literally, whose interests are being benefited and whose interests are not being served? And so long as we give the people the courage to say that we believe in ongoing revelations. So the canon is one thing, but what the Holy Spirit is continuing to say to us as communities who are living in an era where, in the midst of dramatic change, and this is something I've always held for myself, that when the biblical texts were being created, no one had my reality in mind as it was being created, which is not to say that we ignore the text, it's to say that we read it with the hermeneutic of suspicion.
Okay, we had one more question. Brooke, do you just want to?
Oh, yeah, I'll take it. Yeah, happy to take it.
Yes,
Go ahead,
I could
Sam.
probably say it better than I can type it.
Okay.
So I can never just ask one question. Wow. I'm curious, what are the barriers to like collective action? So like trying to implement whatever the necessary changes are, and what are the like resistance models that y'all are pulling from? So like we can pull from the civil rights, like the strategies, there's like a playbook, but I don't know British history when it comes to stuff like that. So I'm curious what resistance models y'all could pull from for this movement.
Yeah. So I think one of the two biggest barriers that we've always had in Britain around trying to have sort of collective movements is, firstly, is the way in which class has always been a central factor within British life, perhaps more so than America. That Britain, we are acutely class conscious. And because of class consciousness, it makes it hard to create a larger movement, because what you always get is this classic divide and rule. It's this classic way in which people with money and capital are always encouraged to identify with other people with money and capital, but not to identify with people with whom they have a shared identity. So the classic example in our present context is, take our Conservative government. It is diverse. It's the most diverse government in the history of British parliamentary politics that goes back 500 years. So our Prime Minister is an Asian man. A Home Secretary that is the equivalent of oh gosh, it's got to my head now. So equivalent of the Home Secretary would be well, it's irrelevant, but essentially that is another Asian woman. Our former Chief Financial Officer was a black man. And people kept saying, oh, it's wonderful, look how diverse the Conservative government is. But here's the thing, these were all millionaires who were committed to neoliberal politics. And in each case, what they had in common was that, like, they hated their own kind who were poor. They hated their own kind. So I'll give an example. Our Home Secretary is an Asian woman who comes from Kenya. And she came to Britain. So when black nationalist governments came in Kenya and Uganda in the late 60s, and the most famous one would be Idi Amin in Uganda, they ran all the Asians out. They said, but it should be Africa for Africans. We don't want white people here, and we don't want these Asian people here who have come and set up business under the British Empire, that we're going to run them out. And most of them came to Britain. They came to Britain and got sanctuary in Britain. So that's her family. So her family, although they are come from India historically, she herself was born in Uganda, but came with her parents when she was small. She herself has openly said that, like, so what she's done is to pass policies now, like to make immigration really hard. Again, a kind of Trumpist move, you know, and so put the borders up, make it really hard for people from other countries to come into Britain. It was pointed out to her. They said, but wait a minute, but like, you come from immigration yourself. Under your own rules, your own parents will not be able to come into this country. And she said, I know, but I don't care. I know, but I don't care. I'm going to pass these policies because they're good for Britain and will make Britain better again. Now, this is an Asian woman doing this. So what we have at the moment are policies that have been passed that even Margaret Thatcher would not have done. So Thatcher is your Reagan. So 80s was neoliberalism, cut loose, white supremacy. But
What should she call the Iron Lady?
yeah, the Iron Lady, because she just did not care. But here's the thing. She now looks like a liberal. She now looks like a liberal. I remember an African-American friend of mine saying during Trumpism, he said, Anthony, he says, I never thought I would look back and think that Ronald Reagan actually looked quite liberal now. So what has happened in Britain is that this class consciousness, this class differentiation has always been used as a way of divide and rule. So as soon as Black folk make money, the first thing they do is that like they move away from Black communities, they join white communities, and they don't identify with the community from which they came. And that is built into the DNA in terms of how Britain operates. So it's very much about sort of divide and rule. The part of the other tension, I think, which maybe you have in America as well, but I can only speak for over here, is that in a curious way, the more our communities become more middle class, even though there's still huge amounts of poverty. But on the whole, the last 50, 60 years, that Black communities have become more affluent. Is the more affluent we become, is the more we then buy into this part of a broader context of a kind of individualization of how we live rather than a more community-based living. So when I was growing up, that because all of us were Black and poor, like we all lived close together, and there was a large extended family. So one of the jokes was, if you're growing up in Bradford, certainly when I was a kid, that if you were out on the street playing with your friends, you would guarantee that if you met any Black person, like they know your parents. And so basically, if you behaved badly, it would always get back home before you got back home, because so-and-so would know so-and-so, the person so-and-so, that, and then you get home, right? And then immediately you'll have your mum at the door saying, I heard what you got up to today. And you think, but how did you know that you went? Because there were eyes and ears all over the community. What has happened is that the more affluent you get and the more choices you get, and I'm not complaining about that, you know, I'm not, my parents had no choice where they live. I have a choice because I have a greater economic base as a middle-class academic. So the truth is, I live in a white majority neighborhood. It's a nice neighborhood. There's not a lot of crime there, not a lot of muggings. It's, you know, it's a nice place to live, but I'm aware of the fact that I'm not clued into communities in the way in which my parents were. So I have to make an effort. It's not natural. I have to deliberately find ways to connect with others in order that I don't live this isolated life as a Black academic. And I think that's where the church still has an important role. The church is still the place that brings people together from across different classes in order to be part of a collective struggle for solidarity. And so I think one of the things I'm teaching now in my work, and other people are teaching, is to say to pastors, what we need is not just to think of the church as a congregation, but to think of the church as something that serves the broader community in which we are all in this together, whether we're saved or not saved, that Jesus came to give full life for all of us, irrespective of whether we go to church and we believe certain doctrines or whether we don't. That I think the threat to us from increasing right-wing governments who are doing things that we would have never heard of, you know. I mean, Margaret Thatcher never deported anyone. She probably thought of it, but didn't imagine that she could get away with it. Now they can get away with it. They are doing it with impunity. What we need, therefore, is solidarity, and we don't have the luxury of someone saying, but I'm saved and therefore I'm okay, but someone outside isn't. Is to say, actually, all of us are Black people, and being saved and washing the blood of the Lamb does not stop you from being a victim of white supremacy. So I think that is what a number of us are pushing now in terms of this sense of solidarity. And Christianity not being the only means of that, but it is an important means by which we can also fight this classism that has always been rife within British life.
All right. We can all unmic. Let us give our very sincere thanks to Dr. Anthony Reddie for the time that he has spent.
Thank you so
Thank you,
much,
Zelda.
Dr.
Thank
Reddie.
you.
Thank you so much.
Well, we hope that we can
Thank you.
invite you back. You know, I love to
Yes.
talk to you.
Yes, I would love to come back. Seriously, I would love to come back. I
Please.
really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Well, this concludes our event, and I'd like to thank the Black Seminarian Network, as well as MTSO's Anti-Racism Task Force, for also being a part of planning this event. Okay, bye. See you,
Bye, everyone.
everyone.